The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students.
The Iran and Libya sanctions bill I signed today will help to deny those countries the money they need to finance international terrorism.
Hundreds of thousands of Iranians reportedly took to the streets today. They won't allow foreign reporters in the country. They reportedly shut down train service, cell phones, and responded to protesters with tear gas, beatings, and arrests.
The U.S. court has won a default judgment that Iranian officials, including its supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, provided help to the 9/11 hijackers behind the worst terror attack on American soil.
Iran's threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. About a fifth of the oil traded worldwide goes through there.
President Obama has imposed new sanctions on Iran and its central bank. The move was mandated by Congress to increase pressure on the Iranian regime over its nuclear program.
This is what Americans have typically seen of Iran since its revolution of 1979. But there's a lot more to the story of our scarred relationship.
I would say it was a relationship between unequals and obviously was greatly resented.
The prime minister of the time, the first ever to be elected, Mohammad Mossadegh, realized how much wealth his country could gain by taking back what he believed to be rightfully theirs. Many of Iran's oil reserves were controlled by the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later be known as British Petroleum. So Mossadegh nationalized these reserves and the Iranian government took control from the British. Both the United States and England felt threatened by the inevitable rise in prices on the petroleum that they relied on so extensively.
I returned in triumph from Rome. This coup had been the CIA's safest...
In 1953, the United States, with help from England, staged a coup d'etat that would permanently alter the relationship between the two powers. They restored the Pahlavi family to the throne, eliminating Mossadegh and infuriating the Iranian people. The newly initiated Shah was a great ally to the Americans, originally forming strong ties between the two nations. In 1963, the Shah used money recently acquired by oil profits to issue a series of reforms, together called the Right Revolution. These reforms gave women more rights, nationalized many of the country's resources, and attempted to raise literacy rates and decrease the difference between social classes.
It was this interference, really, in people's daily lives that was part of the resentment that built up ending in revolution in 1979.
Some of the Shah's activities were popular. He took land away from wealthy landowners, and that was certainly popular for the farmers who got the land. It was not popular, of course, among the wealthy elite, and particularly not among the religious. Ayatollah Khomeini and a number of the conservative Shia clerics were not in favor of giving women equal rights.
Ayatollah Khomeini was a radical politician who gained many followers in the Iranians upset by the results of the White Revolution. He would go on to become the figurehead of the 1979 revolution that would overthrow the Shah.
Iranians saw that he had real courage. He was willing to speak out against the Shah and risk his life. He was imprisoned, he was exiled for a long period, and so he had a certain moral stature, frankly, that others in Iranian society did not have.
Khomeini's popularity grew as he continued to lead protests and movements against the Shah until his arrest in 1963. Khomeini's arrest and exile sparked massive riots and a multitude of demonstrations led by his followers throughout Iran. In 1971, the Shah held a party for the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire. The lavishness of this party was a huge contrast to the lives of the starving people on Iran's streets, and only emphasized the rapidly increasing difference in social classes, and served to turn more Iranian people against the Shah. This social gap only continued to grow through the 1970s oil boom.
He was involved in the formation of the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, which during and after the Middle East War of 1973 quadrupled oil prices, which threw the United States economy into a real tailspin.
It also caused inflation in Iran. The Shah tried to fix this by cutting spending, and people began to get laid off. This gave Iranians even more of a reason to dislike the Shah.
In early 1978, there was an article that was put into a newspaper, a government newspaper, that denounced Khomeini, and it caused a riot among the clerical students in the holy city of Qum, which was suppressed very viciously. That was kind of the beginning of it. And then what happens, of course, if you know the Shia tradition, after 40 days you have to have a ceremony mourning the dead. And so 40 days after the people were killed in this demonstration in Qum, there were more demonstrations, and they started to spread all around the country, and they started to get larger and larger. And when the government cracked down and killed people, you would have, of course, the funerals and then the mourning ceremonies 40 days later.
In August of 1978, fire broke out at a very full cinema in Abadan. This was blamed on the government, and funerals were held for over 400 people. Riots protesting the government broke out at these funerals, causing more casualties and more funerals at which to protest.
They would just shout "Down with Shah" and "Death to America," and at some point they were even burning the flags, U.S. flags.
In September, the Shah instigated martial law, forbidding all riots and protests. However, the people continued to protest, and on one particular Friday, known as Black Friday, many Iranians gathered in Jaleh Square to protest peacefully. The Iranian government responded to their people's protests with violence. Troops had machine guns and were shooting at the massive crowds gathered in the square, now called Martyrs Square for the many casualties. The exact number is unknown. By December of 1978, there were about 2 million people protesting, and the numbers weren't going to stop increasing. On January 16, 1979, the Shah and his wife Farah Pahlavi left the country on a temporary vacation, but under the advice of many, they would never return.
I would say that, the happiness unfortunately didn't last very long, but at least initially it was extremely popular that the Shah had been overthrown by the popular will of the Iranian people.
On February 1, 1979, Khomeini returned to Iran from exile and took power.
He also fooled people because he claimed when he was in exile that he would bring democracy to Iran. And of course, once the revolution succeeded, he did not bring democracy to Iran. He brought something else.
President Jimmy Carter, the man who had previously been a great friend and ally to the Shah, only grudgingly let him into the country, worried it would further mar the relationship between Iran and the U.S. Iran was furious with the U.S. They wanted the Shah to return to Iran for a trial, which would most likely result in an execution. On November 4, 1979, Iranian students took over the American embassy in Iran, holding 52 Americans hostage. After 444 days, the hostages were released, but the incident had taken a huge toll on the relationship. It was the end of relations between Iran and the United States.
I have two brothers who were here, and they were working at the time in Los Angeles, and I know at the time that they could not. They told me they had to quit their job because they were afraid to go in the streets.
And it presented an image of Iran that the country has never really been able to overcome.
Resentment between the countries continues to increase. Events over the years continue to add scars to our relationship. The hostage situation in 1979, the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s. The U.S. sold arms to Iran to win the release of U.S. hostages in Lebanon and illegally used the profits to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The axis of evil in 2002. President George W. Bush labeled Iran, along with Iraq and North Korea, as the axis of evil. Economic sanctions on Iran. The development of nuclear weapons in recent years. There are mounting global concerns that Iran is using its nuclear program to develop weapons of mass destruction. High gas prices. Although the U.S. won't allow any Iranian oil imports, anytime Iran threatens to close the Straits of Hormuz or otherwise limit its oil production, global oil prices, and hence U.S. gas prices, rise, an enduring legacy of a troubled relationship. We can't erase the past, but we can learn from it. Iran can learn to confront its problems diplomatically, and the U.S. can learn not to force its beliefs on other countries. We live in the same world, so we have to learn to work together peacefully, despite our differences.